Reverend Dorothy Anne Caldwell had been the pastor of Greater Bethel Community Church for 26 years. She had been ordained at 31. She had taken the pulpit at Greater Bethel at 33 when the previous pastor, Reverend Harold James, had retired to South Carolina after 41 years of service. He had handed her the key to the side office, the one with the broken window latch that she had not fixed for 8 years, because it was how the janitor, Mr. Gaines, got in on cold mornings when he arrived before anyone else, and he had said the people are the church. Everything else is architecture. She had written that in the front of her first pastoral journal. She had filled 43 journals since. She was still filling them. Her mother, Harriet, had been a seamstress and a deaconess at First Baptist on the West Side for 37 years. She had mended other people's clothes and organized other people's funerals and sat with other people's sick, and had done all of it without being asked and without keeping a ledger of what she was owed. She had told Dorothy once while hemming a dress at the kitchen table, "When you find the thing that you are supposed to do in this world, you will know it because you will not be able to stop doing it, even when it costs you." She had said the cost is not an argument against the thing. It is how you know the thing is real. Dorothy had thought about this for 30 years. She still thought about it. Harriet had started sewing at 11. Her grandmother had taught her. She had a sewing room in the house on Colton Street with 2 machines and a cutting table and a wall of fabric organized by weight and color. She had never charged what the work was worth. She had charged what people could pay. When they could not pay, she had taken something else. A jar of preserves, an afternoon of help in the garden, the knowledge that next year, when they could pay, they would. She had never been cheated in this system. She had built over 37 years a reputation for honesty and precision that traveled ahead of her in the way that only genuine reputations do. People brought her the things that mattered, the dress that had belonged to the grandmother, the suit that had to be right for the interview, the shirt that the child needed to look well in on a day when looking well was all the family had to offer against the other things that day was going to ask of them. She understood what she was holding when she held those things. She handled them accordingly. As a deaconess, she had organized 41 annual church dinners, 9 building fund drives, and 1 funeral for a family that had no money and no connections, and whose son had died at 23 in circumstances that left the community divided about how to receive the grief. She had organized that funeral the same way she organized the others. She had not waited to be asked. She had not checked the circumstances against a list. She had said, "There is a family that needs a service. We are the church. That is the service." She had organized it. The family had come. The church had received them. That was the whole thing. She had told Dorothy on the day Dorothy was ordained, "Every person who comes through any door you open is going to be carrying something. Your job is not to know in advance what it is. Your job is to be the kind of place where they can put it down." She had said you cannot be that place if you are deciding beforehand who gets to come in. She had said the door is the door. Dorothy had said, "What if someone comes in who makes it harder for others to come in?" Harriet had said that is the hardest thing in the work. She had said, "And you will figure it out when it comes." She had said, "But don't close the door before it comes. You will close the wrong door." Her father, Calvin, had been a high school history teacher for 31 years at Jefferson High. He had taught American history, which he considered the most complicated subject in any curriculum, and which he had taught with a consistent and uncompromising accuracy that had earned him both a devoted following among students who needed to understand why the world was the way it was, and a consistent friction with administrators who preferred a smoother version. He had not taught a smoother version. He had said to Dorothy when she was 16, "The record is the record. You can offer a partial account, but you cannot make a partial account into a complete one by teaching it with confidence." She had said, "But some people prefer the partial account." He had said, "Some people prefer a comfortable house. That does not mean every house is comfortable. It means some people have not lived in the other kind." He had said, "Your job is to teach the whole record, not just for the people who already suspect it, for the people who have never had to. He had taught 31 years and had kept notes, not lesson plans, notes on the students, what each class needed to understand and why. Which year had come to him already knowing that the story was complicated, and which year had come expecting the clean version. He had 3 notebooks for each year. The first covered the fall semester. The second covered the spring. The third was what he had wanted to teach that he had not been able to fit in the curriculum. He had 93 notebooks. They were on shelves in the study at the house on Colton Street. He had been retired for 9 years. He still added to the third notebook. He said there is always more of the record. The record does not stop when the semester ends. He had told Dorothy when she was thinking about the ministry, the work you are describing is the same work I do. She had said, you teach history. He had said, I teach people to read the full record. He had said, you are going to do the same thing. In a different room, with different tools, but the work is the same. He had said the people who do not know the full record of who they are, where they came from, what was built for them, what it cost those people are easier to convince they are worth less than they are. He had said you are going to stand in a room and remind people of the full record. He had said that is a more useful thing than most things I can think of. He had come to the shelter in the second year. He had come on a Thursday evening in January. He had sat in the fellowship hall and drunk coffee and watched. He had not spoken much. He had watched Althea run the intake process. He had watched the volunteers move between the tables. He had watched Dorothy move through the room. He had left at 9 o'clock and had called her the next morning. He had said, you are doing it. She had said, what? He had said what I spent 31 years trying to do. He had said, you are telling people the whole record, not in words, in the room. He had said you are saying you are the full record, not the difficult circumstance, not the category, the full record. He had said the building says it. Every night you open the building, it says you are the full record and you belong here. He had said that is the thing. She had said, Dad. He had said, I know. He had said, keep the building open. Dorothy had taken his thinking and built it into her theology. She believed that the church was not a place of comfort for the comfortable. She believed it was a place of comfort for the uncomfortable and a place of challenge for the comfortable. She had said this from the pulpit enough times that her congregation knew it. They stayed anyway. That was what she measured, not numbers, but whether the people who stayed were growing. She thought most of them were. She had started at Greater Bethel as the associate pastor under Reverend James in the year before he retired. He had taken 1 year to show her the building, not its rooms and its utilities, though he showed her those too. He had shown her the weight of it. He had shown her the families who had been coming for 3 generations and what they carried. He had shown her the families who came once and did not come back and what they had needed and not found. He had told her when you know what someone needed and didn't find, you know what to build. He had said everything I built here was because someone came once and I could see what they needed and I didn't have it yet. He had said 20 years of that, and you have the building. She had said, what did you not build? He had thought for a long time. He had said, I did not build a place for people who had nowhere to sleep in winter. He had said, I knew they were out there. I did not build the thing. He had said, that is yours to build. She had thought he meant it as a suggestion. She had understood later that he meant it as a commission. She had opened the shelter in year 3 of her pastorate. She had not planned it as a major undertaking. She had been at a city council meeting about housing resources. She had heard the number 1,100 individuals with no regular shelter in the winter months. She had driven home. She had sat in the fellowship hall in the dark. She had looked at the room. She had thought this room holds 160 for a seated dinner. It could hold 28 cots. She had thought, I have a commercial kitchen. I have a building that is warm. I have volunteers who have been asking me for 3 years to find them something useful to do. She had sat in the dark for 1 hour. She had gone home. She had called James Whitfield the next morning. She had said, I want to open the building as an emergency shelter this winter. Tell me what I need. He had said a conditional use permit. She had said, "How long does that take?" He had said it depends on the zoning board. It could be 6 months. It could be 14. She had said 14 months is next November. He had said yes. She had said start the application. The 14 months had included 3 public hearings and 2 plan revisions, and 1 meeting with a neighborhood association that had objections, and 1 meeting with the zoning board where Dorothy had sat at the table for 2 hours and answered every question from the record she had built and had left with a conditional approval, and had spent the drive home thinking about what Harriet had said about the cost not being an argument against the thing. She had received the permit in October. She had opened the shelter November 1st. That was 6 years ago. Greater Bethel Community Church was on the corner of Mallard and 16th. It had been there since 1941. The original building had been a converted warehouse. The current building had been built in 1967 and renovated in 1994, and again in 2011. It had a sanctuary that seated 420. It had a fellowship hall that seated 160 for a seated dinner and 200 standing. It had a commercial kitchen that had been built in 2011 specifically to support the food ministry. It had a side door on 16th Street with a ramp and automatic door that had been installed in 2008 when 3 congregation members had reached ages where the front steps were prohibitive. It had a parking lot behind it that held 43 spaces. The emergency shelter had been running for 6 years. It opened on November 1st of each year and ran through March 15th. It served adult women and family units. It had 16 cots in the fellowship hall and 12 in the meeting room off the east corridor. 28 beds total. Dorothy had not decided to open a shelter. She had decided to respond to a specific need she could see. In the first winter of operation, they had served 47 individuals. In the second, 62. In the third, 71. In the 6th year, the year in question, they had served 94 individuals between November and the 3rd week of February when the incident occurred. Dorothy knew the numbers because she kept them in the journals. Not as totals, as people. Each journal from the shelter years contained the intake logs as appendices. Not the full names, those were kept separately and confidentially, but first names and the number of nights each person had stayed, and the outcome as best she could track it. Left for transitional housing, left for family, left for a job placement that required relocation. Left and did not return, which she noted without interpretation, because she did not always know what it meant. Returned after a gap which she noted with the date and the context as provided. She tracked these because Calvin had taught her that the record of a thing is the record of the people in it. You do not summarize the people. You note them. You note them because they are the whole reason the building exists. In 6 years of journals, the name that appeared most often in the outcome column was left for independent housing. That was the outcome she had built the shelter to produce. Not the warmth, though the warmth mattered enormously on an 11-degree night. The outcome. The thing that happened after. She tracked it because if she could not track it, she could not improve toward it. If she could not improve toward it, the shelter was a pause and not a progression. She wanted it to be a progression. In 6 years it had been both. She was satisfied with the ratio. She intended to improve it. The shelter operated under a conditional use permit issued by the city, permit number CU-2018-0084. Dorothy had the permit number memorized. She had applied for it herself and had attended 3 public hearings before it was approved, and had revised the facility plan twice to address objections from the city's zoning office, and had waited 14 months for the final approval. The permit specified the maximum number of occupants, the operating hours, the required safety equipment, and the inspection schedule. The church had been inspected twice a year since the permit was issued. Both inspections in the most recent cycle, 6 weeks before the incident, had been passed with no deficiencies noted. The most recent inspection report was in the file drawer in Dorothy's office. She knew exactly where it was. Althea Martin had been the volunteer coordinator since the 2nd year. She had been a retired social worker. She had worked family services for 29 years and had seen every failure mode that an institution could produce. She had also seen every success mode. She had retired at 62 with no intention of doing nothing. She had come to Dorothy at the start of the shelter's second year. She had said, "I know how to run an intake process. I know how to build a volunteer schedule. I know how to train people who have never done this work. I know how to keep a calm room when things become uncomfortable." She had said, "Tell me what you need." Dorothy had said, "Come on Monday." Althea had come Monday. She had not missed a scheduled shift in 5 years. She had built the intake process from scratch. Name date emergency, contact if any specific needs medical requirements, any documentation needed for the morning. Not intrusive, complete. She had trained each new volunteer in the intake process, and in the rule she called the first rule, the person in front of you is not a category. They are a person. Respond to the person. She had not written this rule on a sign. She had said it at the start of every volunteer orientation and had watched to see whether the volunteers absorbed it or filed it. The ones who absorbed it stayed. The ones who filed it usually found other work by the third shift. That was fine. Not everyone had the disposition for the work. She was not interested in people who stayed but did not absorb. She was interested in people who stayed and changed. Mr. Gaines had been keeping the building since 1997. His name was Franklin Gaines. He had come to the church 27 years ago when he was 41 looking for work. He had not found the church by any particular route. He had been walking past on a Tuesday and had seen Reverend James on a ladder cleaning the gutters and had said, "Let me help you with that." He had been hired the following week. He had outlasted Reverend James and had been there when Dorothy arrived and had shown her the building the way a long-serving employee shows a new leader. The building with the proprietary care of someone who has kept it running through things the leader has not yet seen. He had shown her the furnace schedule. He had shown her the roof drain that needed watching in March. He had shown her the side door latch. He had said, "I fix things before they break." He had said, "I have not always succeeded." He had said, "But I have always tried." Dorothy had asked him once in year 4 what he made of the shelter. He had been filling a thermos at the kitchen counter. He had said, "This building has been here since 1941. He had said, "I have been keeping it since 1997. He had said, "It has been used for many things." He had said, "This is the right use." He had said, "A building this old has warmth in the walls, not just from the furnace, from what it has been." He had said, "The people who sleep here feel that." He had gone back to his thermos. He had not elaborated. He had not needed to. It was a Thursday evening in February. The temperature had dropped to 11 degrees. The shelter had been open since 5 o'clock. It was 7:44 when Officer Brian Callahan arrived. He was 31 years old. He had been with the department for 5 years. He had been assigned to the 16th Street corridor for the past 18 months. He said he had received a complaint about a disturbance. He had not specified the nature of the complaint when he came to the front door. He had spoken to the volunteer coordinator, a woman named Althea Martin, who had been volunteering with the shelter since the second year. She had told him, "This is Greater Bethel Emergency Shelter. We are operating under city permit, CU-2018-0084. We have 28 guests tonight. There is no disturbance." He had said, "I need to see the permit." Althea had said, "The permit is in Pastor Caldwell's office. I can get her." He had said, "I need to see it." Althea had called Dorothy on the intercom. Dorothy had come from the fellowship hall where she had been helping distribute the evening meal. She had her hands still damp from the serving line. She had dried them on her apron. She had asked Callahan to come into the side hallway. She had walked to her office. She had opened the file drawer. She had taken out the permit. She had given it to him. He had looked at it. He had looked at the document. He had read the permit number. He had read the expiration date. The permit did not expire until October of the current year. He had looked at the occupancy limit. The permit said 30. The shelter currently had 28 guests, plus the 4 volunteers, plus Dorothy. 33 people total in a building permitted for 420 in the sanctuary and 160 in the fellowship hall. He said this permit is for 30 occupants. Dorothy said the permit specifies 30 overnight guests. We have 28. He said there are other people in the building. She said yes. There are 4 volunteers and myself. The permit language refers to shelter guests. She said the permit was written with my city liaison. If you would like to clarify the language, I can give you his name and number. He said, I am going to need you to close the shelter tonight. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. She looked at the permit in his hand. She said, the permit is valid. We are within the specified guest limit. We have passed the most recent inspection. It is 11 degrees tonight. She said, I am not going to close the shelter tonight. She said, if you believe we are in violation of a specific provision of this permit, I would like you to tell me which provision. He said, you are potentially over capacity. She said, we are not over capacity. I have 28 guests and 4 volunteers. The permit specifies 30 overnight guests. We are 2 under the guest limit. He said, I am conducting a capacity assessment. She said, would you like to walk the facility? He said he would. She walked him through the fellowship hall where 28 individuals were eating or resting. She walked him through the meeting room. She showed him the cots. She showed him the registration log. 28 names, 28 intake forms. She showed him the inspection report from 6 weeks prior. She showed him the emergency exit signage. She showed him the fire extinguisher certificates. Everything was in order. He looked at everything. He did not produce a specific violation. He said, I'm going to need to call my supervisor. He went back to his patrol car. Dorothy went back to the fellowship hall. She did not tell the guests what was happening. She told Althea quietly. Althea said, should I call someone? Dorothy said, call James. James was Deacon James Whitfield, who had been on the church board for 16 years, and who had also been a paralegal for 22 years, and who had, on 3 prior occasions involving the shelter, been the person Dorothy had called when she needed to know what the law actually said. She also called the city's after-hours line for permitting and zoning. The person who answered took her information. They said they would pass it to the duty officer. Callahan came back after 11 minutes. He was with a second officer, a woman named Officer Chen, who had been with the department for 8 years. Callahan said, I need you to begin moving guests out. He said the facility does not meet current standards. Dorothy said, what current standards? She said, I have the permit. I have the inspection report from 6 weeks ago. She said, what specific standard are we not meeting? He said, I am citing the building as a potential fire hazard. Dorothy said, we passed fire inspection 6 weeks ago. She said, if there is a fire hazard, I would like you to specify the location and nature of the hazard. Officer Chen had been standing at the hallway door. She had been listening. She said, Officer Callahan, can I see the complaint that initiated this call? Callahan said it was a verbal complaint. Chen said, do you have a case number? Callahan said, I called it in from the car. Chen said, what is the complaint number? He did not produce a complaint number. He said he had called it in on the radio. Chen said, I will confirm with dispatch. She called dispatch. She came back 3 minutes later. She said to Dorothy, there is a complaint log from earlier tonight at this address. She said the complaint had been logged at 7:12 p.m. The complaint had not specified a disturbance. The complaint had said large number of people coming and going from the church. That was the complaint. People entering and exiting a building on a cold night. Chen said to Callahan, there is no disturbance complaint. There is no fire hazard on record. She said the pastor has a valid permit and a current inspection report. She said, I am not comfortable with proceeding. Dorothy said, thank you. She said, what I would like is for you both to leave. She said, it is 11 degrees. We have 28 people inside. She said, if your department has a legitimate basis for action, I will respond to it through the appropriate channels. She said, tonight we are going to continue serving these 28 people. Callahan said he was going to call his supervisor again. He went back outside. James Whitfield had arrived. He had driven directly from his house, still in his coat over his dinner clothes. He had the church's conditional use permit file in a folder. He had the municipal code section on emergency shelter operations highlighted. He had the inspection report. He had a printed copy of the after-hours permitting contact and the city ombudsman's number. James had been on the church board for 16 years. He had also been a paralegal for 22 years at a civil rights firm in the city and had spent those 22 years preparing cases that turned on whether the record said what the record said. He understood documents the way a surgeon understood a body, by system, by sequence, by the relationship between what was present and what was missing. He had called it at a church board meeting once applied literacy. He had said you read every document completely. You read it in the order it was created. You read it against the documents that came before and after. You look for what is there. You look for what is not there. He had said the absence in a document is as informative as the presence. When there is no complaint number, there is no complaint. When there is no documented deficiency, there is no deficiency. He had said, the absence speaks. Learn to hear it. He had helped Dorothy with the permit application in year 1. He had attended all 3 public hearings. He had spoken at the first and the third. He had responded to the neighborhood association's objections at the second meeting with a 12-page memo that addressed each objection with specific reference to the municipal code and existing case studies from comparable operations in other cities. The zoning board had cited the memo in their conditional approval. He had not mentioned this to Dorothy until 2 years later when she had asked. He had said, I wrote the memo. They used it. That is the record. There is nothing more to say about it. He had been called 3 times in 6 years for shelter-related issues. The first had been a noise complaint in year 2 that turned out to be a car alarm in the parking lot and nothing to do with the shelter. The second had been a question from the city's license office about whether the food service required a separate permit, which it did not under the terms of the conditional use permit when the food was provided free of charge. He had resolved that in a phone call. The third was the present incident. He had classified this one differently from the first 2. He had known from Dorothy's call that this one would produce a formal record. He said, what is his basis? Dorothy said he cited fire hazard. He said, is there a specific deficiency? Dorothy said no. He said, then there is no basis. He said he can assert a general concern and it will go nowhere if there is no specific deficiency. He said, who is Chen? Dorothy said she seems to be reading the situation correctly. He said, good. He said, I am going to stay until this is resolved. The supervisor arrived at 8:51. Her name was Sergeant Irene Park. She had been with the department for 18 years. She had supervised the 16th Street corridor for 4 of them. She had in those 4 years driven past Greater Bethel Community Church many times. She had seen the shelter light on in winter evenings many times. She had never had a call to it. She came inside. She introduced herself to Dorothy. She said, I understand there has been a concern about operating capacity. Dorothy said we are within the capacity specified in our conditional use permit. She handed Sergeant Park the permit. She handed her the inspection report. She handed her the registration log. 28 names. She said, I have 28 guests, 4 volunteers, and myself. The permit specifies 30 overnight guests. She said, we are in compliance. Park read the permit. She read the inspection report. She looked at the registration log. She said, this looks to be in order. She said, is there a specific deficiency that has been identified? Callahan said there may be a fire egress issue. Park said, where? Callahan said, in the east corridor. Park said, have you documented it? He had not documented it. Park said, let's walk it. They walked the east corridor. Dorothy walked with them. James walked behind. The corridor had 2 exit signs, both illuminated. The corridor had 1 fire extinguisher mounted at 42 inches as required. The corridor had no obstructions. Park said, I don't see a deficiency. She said to Callahan, what were you observing? He said it seemed narrow. She said it meets code. She looked at Dorothy. She said, "I apologize for the disruption." She said, "You are in compliance." She said, "We will not be asking you to close tonight." She said, "I'm sorry about the timing." Dorothy said, "It is 11 degrees." Park said, "I know." She said, "You have done good work here." Dorothy said, "The guests have done the hard work. We provide the building." They left. Dorothy stood in the fellowship hall. She looked at the 28 people there. Some of them had heard the commotion. Some of them had not. None of them had been disturbed from their meals. Althea and the other volunteers had kept the fellowship hall calm throughout. They had brought out the dessert course early. They had maintained the temperature of the room. They had kept the normal operations of the shelter running while Dorothy was in the hallway. That was what a good team did. That was what 26 years of building something had produced. She told the guests that there had been a routine check-in by the city, and that everything was fine, and that tonight's dessert was going to be apple pie, because Mrs. Francine Okafor had baked 4 of them, and they needed to be eaten before they went cold. This produced the response that apple pie in a warm room on an 11-degree night generally produced. Mrs. Okafor had been baking for the shelter since year 1. She had brought pies and cakes and cobblers and cornbread and 3 kinds of pound cake over 6 years. She had never announced what she was bringing. She had never asked for acknowledgement. She had told Dorothy once, "At some point you have been doing the thing long enough that the doing of it is the whole point." She had said, "These people eat the pie. That is the whole thing." Dorothy had said, "It is a very good pie." Mrs. Okafor had said, "I know." She had gone back to the kitchen. Dorothy watched 4 pies get cut and served in 20 minutes. She watched the room settle. She watched Althea move between the tables, pausing at each one. She watched the room do what it had been built to do. The room had not stopped during the 31 minutes. It had continued. It did not stop. That was what 26 years and 14 months of permits and 3 public hearings had produced. A room that did not stop. She went to her office. She sat down. She opened the 43rd journal. She wrote the date and the time and what had happened, and what had been said, and what documentation had been produced, and what the outcome was. She wrote CU-2018-0084 presented and confirmed valid. Inspection report confirmed current. Registration log 28 guests within limit. She wrote, Sergeant Park resolved appropriately. She wrote, Officer Callahan had no specific deficiency to cite. Complaint log did not specify a disturbance. She wrote, shelter remained open. All 28 guests remained housed through the night. She wrote 11 degrees outside. She wrote one more thing. She wrote, Harriet said the cost is not an argument against the thing. She wrote she was right. She put the journal in the drawer. She went back to the fellowship hall. What she did not know yet was that a man named Thomas Odom had been in the fellowship hall the whole time. He was 52 years old. He had been a guest at the shelter for 6 nights. He had been an electrician for 19 years and had lost the business in the 2nd year of the pandemic, not because the work had stopped, but because the injury to his left hand had stopped the work. He had been in physical therapy for 7 months and had been in transitional housing for 4, and had been at Greater Bethel for 6 nights when Callahan arrived. He was not a person who considered himself vulnerable. He was a person who had been in a difficult circumstance and was moving through it with the same discipline he had brought to the electrical trade. He had a plan. The plan required a place to stay while he executed it. Greater Bethel was the place. He intended to be gone by the end of the month. He had heard the conversation from where he sat. He had not been able to hear all of it. He had heard the words close and permit and 11 degrees. He had understood the shape of the situation immediately. He had also understood something about Dorothy that he had understood from the first night she was not going to yield. He had watched her for 6 nights. He had watched how she moved through the fellowship hall, how she spoke to each person as though the conversation they were having was the most important thing happening in the building. How she had sat for 30 minutes with a woman named Celestine, who had arrived on the 4th night and had not spoken to anyone, until Dorothy sat beside her and did not ask her anything and simply sat. He had watched that. He had decided on the third night that Dorothy was the kind of person his grandmother had told him about. The kind who stayed. He had his phone out because he had been texting his nephew about the plan. He had seen Callahan in the hallway. He had started filming. He had not thought through what he would do with it. He had thought this should be documented. He had filmed 4 minutes and 30 seconds. He had captured enough. He had captured Dorothy handing over the permit. He had captured Callahan saying he was going to need to close the shelter. He had captured Dorothy saying it is 11 degrees. We have 28 people inside. He had captured her saying she was not going to close the shelter tonight. He had captured her voice, clear low, not elevated, not pleading, stating. He had posted it at 9:42. He had 300 followers. In the morning it had 12,000 views. By noon it had 51,000. By evening the Tribune had the story. Thomas had told Dorothy about the video the next morning. He had come to find her before breakfast. He had said, "I want you to know I filmed it." He had said, "I should have told you last night. I am telling you now." Dorothy had said, "What did you capture?" He had told her. She had said, "Is it accurate?" He had said, "Yes." She had said, "Good." She had said, "Thank you for documenting it." He had said, "I did not know if it was the right thing." She had said, "You documented what happened." "That is the right thing." She had said, "Are you at breakfast?" He had said, "Not yet." She had said, "The scrambled eggs are good this morning. Mrs. Robinson made them, and she does not make bad eggs." He had said, "Yes, ma'am." He had gone to breakfast. He had eaten the eggs. He had left the shelter on March 3rd, 3 weeks later, as he had planned. He had sent Dorothy a letter from his new address in April. He had said, "I am back to work, part-time, while the hand finishes healing." He had said, "Thank you for the building." Dorothy had written it in the journal. She had written Thomas Odom left March 3rd. Sent letter April 19th. Back to work. She had written the building did what it was supposed to do. The reporter was a woman named Imani Brooks, who had covered city affairs and faith communities for 9 years. She had covered Greater Bethel before. She had written about the shelter in year 2 when the operation was new, and she had spent 3 nights observing the intake process with Dorothy's permission. She had written, "This is what a community institution looks like when it decides the community extends beyond its membership." That article had run on a Sunday. Dorothy had kept a copy. It was in the 42nd Journal. She had called Dorothy at 8 a.m. She had said, "I saw the video. I am going to cover the story. I want your account first." Dorothy had told her everything. She had been specific about the sequence. She had been specific about the documentation. She had given Imani the permit number, the inspection report date, the registration log count, and Sergeant Park's name. Imani had said, "Do you want to characterize what motivated Callahan's initial action?" Dorothy had said no. She had said the record characterizes it. "I will let the record speak." She had said there was no complaint that specified a disturbance. There was no documented fire deficiency. There was a valid permit, and a current inspection, and 28 people in the building who were supposed to be there. That is what the record says. She had said, "You write what the record says." Imani had also called the city permitting office and confirmed the permit. She had confirmed the inspection report. She had confirmed that the complaint log from 7:12 p.m. contained no disturbance specification. She had called Officer Chen directly. Chen had confirmed the sequence. She had not made a statement on behalf of the department. She had confirmed what she had personally observed. She had said the permit was valid. The documentation was in order. "I found no deficiency on the walkthrough." She had said, "That is what I observed." Imani had also called James Whitfield. He had given her the municipal code citation. He had said, under this provision, a general concern, people entering a building does not constitute a basis for closure action. He had said a specific observed deficiency is required. He had said no specific deficiency was identified or documented. He had said the action was not authorized by the code. He had said that is all. The article ran the next morning. It was picked up by 6 news organizations by afternoon. Imani had written it without editorializing. She had written the sequence. She had written the permit number. She had written the inspection date. She had written the complaint log entry. She had written Callahan's assertion. She had written Park's finding. She had written the sequence the way Calvin had taught it in 31 years of history class, completely in order without making the partial account into a complete one by teaching it with confidence. She had taught the whole record. The record had said what it said. 6 news organizations had read it and passed it forward. The governor's office called Dorothy at 10:15 the morning the article ran. The governor's director of community affairs, a woman named Patricia Wren, said she was calling on behalf of the governor to confirm the facts of the incident and to express support for Greater Bethel's shelter operation. She said the governor would like to visit the shelter. Dorothy said when would be convenient. She said we operate Monday through Saturday in the winter months. Patricia Wren said tomorrow morning at 9. The governor arrived the next morning at 9:03. He was accompanied by Patricia Wren, 2 staff members, and 1 photographer from his communications office. He asked not to bring press. He said, "I do not want this to be about me. I want to see the operation." Dorothy showed him the operation. She showed him the kitchen first. She showed him the 6-burner range and the commercial refrigerators and the pantry that was organized by a woman named Mrs. Robinson, a congregant who had worked as a kitchen manager for 22 years before retirement, and who had come to Dorothy in year 3 of the shelter and said, "Your pantry organization is not efficient. I would like to fix it." Dorothy had said, "Please." Mrs. Robinson had fixed it. The governor's communications photographer took a photograph of the pantry. Dorothy said Mrs. Robinson organized it. The photographer noted this. She showed him the fellowship hall. There were 31 guests that morning. Some were at the tables with coffee. Some were in the corner where Althea had set up a small resource station with bus passes and a phone charging bank and a list of services organized by what kind of help they provided. The governor paused at the resource station. He said, "Who built this?" Dorothy said, "Althea Martin." She said she was a social worker for 29 years. She said she has been here every scheduled shift for 5 years. The governor nodded. She showed him the cots. She showed him the east corridor. She showed him the exit signs and the fire extinguisher and the specific location where Callahan had said he thought there might be a fire egress issue. The governor stood in the corridor. He said, "What did he cite specifically?" Dorothy said he said it seemed narrow. The governor said nothing. She showed him the registration log. She had replaced the previous night's log with the current morning's 31 guests and the permit hanging now in a frame on the wall in the hallway where Callahan had stood. James Whitfield had framed it that morning. He had not asked. He had simply brought a frame and hung the permit. Dorothy had not objected. The governor read the permit. He read the inspection report that was mounted next to it. He looked at the hallway. "He said this was here the whole time," Dorothy said from the moment we opened. "He said, and he had not read it." Dorothy said he read it when I gave it to him. He looked at it. He said, and then he continued. Dorothy said yes. He said even with the permit in his hand. Dorothy said yes. He looked at the framed permit for a moment. He said, "You built this." Dorothy said we built it together. She said 26 years. He said, "What do you need?" Dorothy said 3 things. She said first, a letter confirming that this shelter's permit is valid and will be supported by the city. He said, "You will have it today." She said second, a protocol for first responders on conditional use shelter operations. She said what to check and in what order before any closure action is initiated. She said the responding officer should review the permit review, the inspection report, and identify a specific documented deficiency before any closure action. In that order. He said, "I will ask my policy director to work with you on that." She said, "I would like to be part of the drafting." He said, "I assumed you would." Dorothy said third. She said more shelters. She said we have 28 beds. Last night we had 31. 3 people slept on cots we do not officially have because we asked them if they wanted to stay and they said yes, and we found 3 more cots in the storage room. She said there are more than 31 people who need shelter on an 11-degree night. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I know." He said, "Yes." He said, "That is the right answer." She said, "I am not asking you to build them. I am asking you to create a mechanism by which buildings like ours can become what we have become more easily." She said, "The 14 months and the 3 hearings and the 2 plan revisions, that is not the right barrier." He said, "You are correct." He said, "I will look at what we can do." He stayed for an hour and 20 minutes. He sat at one of the tables in the fellowship hall and had coffee. He spoke with 2 of the guests who wanted to speak with him. One was a woman named Gloria, who had been at the shelter for 11 nights and who told him about what she needed to get into stable housing. She was specific. She needed a first-month deposit and a co-signer. She had the income for the rent. She had the rental history. She did not have anyone to co-sign. He listened to all of it. He did not promise anything specific. He said, "I am going to give your name to someone in my housing office. I cannot promise an outcome. I can promise that your situation will be reviewed by someone who knows how to help." She said, "That is more than I had this morning." He said, "That is the right way to think about it." He spoke with Althea. She gave him a summary of what the resource station contained and what the gaps were. She spoke for 4 minutes. She was specific. He took notes. He spoke briefly with Mr. Gaines, who had been cleaning the East Corridor when he arrived and who had not stopped to acknowledge the governor's presence until the governor had introduced himself. Mr. Gaines had shaken his hand and said, "Good of you to come," and had gone back to cleaning. The governor had looked at Dorothy. She had said, "He has been keeping this building running since 1997. The governor had said, "Of course he has." He had said, "The building looks like it has been kept." The formal departmental review of the incident took 8 days. The review board examined the complaint log, the permit file, the inspection report, the patrol log for the night, and the accounts of Callahan, Chen, Park, and Dorothy. They also reviewed a portion of Thomas Odom's video, which had been submitted to the Community Affairs Office as a factual record of the incident. It found that Callahan had not documented the original complaint correctly. It found that the complaint log entry for 7:12 p.m. had not specified a disturbance and therefore had not authorized the specific action Callahan had described as complaint-based. It found that the fire hazard assertion had not been supported by an observed deficiency. It found that the corridor in the East Wing met code on every dimension Callahan had cited as a concern. It found that the complaint log did not support the action taken. It found that Officer Chen had followed protocol correctly. It noted that Chen had requested the complaint number before proceeding. It noted that Chen had called dispatch to verify the complaint before agreeing to continue. It commended Chen's adherence to documentation standards and her insistence on reviewing the complaint before proceeding. It noted that the situation had been resolved by Sergeant Park's review of the documentation, which was the same documentation that had been available from the beginning of the interaction. The review board also noted in a supplementary finding that the permit for Greater Bethel Community Church's emergency shelter had been displayed in the facility and available for review throughout the incident. It noted that a review of the permit at the time of initial contact would have resolved the situation before any of the subsequent events. It noted this not to assign additional fault but to establish the baseline for Protocol S7's sequence requirement. It noted the documentation resolves the question. The documentation must be reviewed before the question is escalated. Callahan received a formal reprimand. He was required to complete 12 hours of training in the municipal code provisions governing conditional use permits and emergency shelter operations. He was assigned a 30-day supervised rotation. The protocol that Dorothy had requested was drafted over the following 6 weeks by the City Policy Office in consultation with Dorothy, James Whitfield, and 2 other shelter operators in the city. The city's policy director was a woman named Sandra Beaumont, who had been in municipal policy for 17 years and who had, in that time, drafted 14 city protocols. She understood that a protocol was only as useful as the language it used and the sequence it specified. She had called Dorothy on the first day of the drafting process. She had said, "I want to start with the sequence. What should an officer do, and in what order, before any closure action?" Dorothy had said, first identify the facility. If it is operating under a conditional use permit, obtain the permit number. Sandra had said, and if they don't have the number on site. Dorothy had said every shelter operating under a city permit should have the permit posted. The permit number should be visible. Sandra had said agreed. She had written, permit must be posted in visible location. Dorothy had said second, review the most recent inspection report. If the inspection report shows no deficiencies, that is the baseline. Any concern raised after a clean inspection must be observed and documented. Sandra had said, and third. Dorothy had said third, before any closure action the officer must identify a specific observed deficiency and document it. She had said, a general concern is not a deficiency. A lot of people in a building is not a deficiency. A building full of warm people on a cold night is not a deficiency. She had said the specific deficiency must be this item in this location, does not meet the code provision I can cite by number. Sandra had said that is exactly right. She had said that is exactly what the protocol will say. They had drafted over 4 weeks. James had reviewed the draft for legal precision. The 2 other shelter operators had reviewed it for operational accuracy. Dorothy had reviewed the final version and had sent back 3 comments. All 3 had been accepted. The protocol was issued to all officers in the city. It was named Protocol S7. Dorothy had not named it. The policy director had. She had said, we can name it for you. Dorothy had said, name it for the standard. That is what will last. Sandra had agreed. She had said the standard is the thing. Dorothy had said yes. She had said name it for the thing that is always supposed to happen, not for the thing that didn't. Sandra had agreed with that too. The governor's letter arrived the afternoon he visited. It confirmed the permit's validity. It expressed the governor's support for Greater Bethel's shelter operations. It was on the governor's letterhead. Dorothy put it in the folder with the permit and the inspection report. She made a copy. She put the original in the file drawer. She put the copy in the 43rd journal. She called her mother that evening. Harriet was 78. She still lived in the house on Colton Street where Dorothy had grown up. She still mended things for people. She had stopped taking new clients 3 years ago. She still fixed things for the neighbors who had been bringing her things for 30 years. She answered on the second ring. Dorothy told her about the shelter and about Thursday night and about the governor. Harriet was quiet for most of it. When Dorothy finished, Harriet said, "Did you keep it open?" Dorothy said yes. Harriet said good. She said that is all of it, right there. Dorothy said the governor coming helped. Harriet said the governor coming is because you kept it open. She said what you do first is more important than who shows up after. Dorothy said, I know Mama. Harriet said, I know you know. She said 28 people were warm because you kept it open. That is the whole record. She said that is the whole record right there. Dorothy closed the 43rd journal. She looked at the permit on the wall. She looked at the hallway where Callahan had stood. She thought about her father. She thought about the record is the record. She thought the permit was the record. The inspection report was the record. The registration log was the record. The 28 names on that log were the record. Thomas Odom's 4 minutes and 30 seconds were the record. Imani Brooks's article was the record. The governor's letter was the record. Protocol S7 was the record. And the 43 journals on the shelf behind her desk were the record of 26 years of what happened in this building, and who was in it, and what it cost, and what it produced. She opened the first journal. She had started it the week she was ordained. The first entry was from the ordination service. She had written, Reverend James said the people are the church. Everything else is architecture. She had written, I am going to remember that every time I am tempted to think the building is the thing. She had written the building is not the thing. The people in the building are the thing. The building is what makes the thing possible. She had underlined that last sentence. She had not always remembered it in the moments when she was supposed to. There had been moments in 26 years when the furnace and the roof and the parking lot and the permit applications and the insurance reviews had felt like the whole job. When the architecture had felt like the thing. She had written about those moments in the journals, too. She had written about the year 11 crisis when the boiler had failed in January, and they had spent 3 weeks raising emergency funds while conducting services in coats. She had written the congregation came anyway, every Sunday, in coats. They came to the people, not the warmth. She had written, I need to remember this when the boiler is fixed. She had remembered it. She had written about the year the city had reduced the arts program, and 3 of the children's ministry participants had come to her in tears because the class was gone. She had written, this is the architecture failing. She had written, the church can be the architecture when the city's architecture fails. She had figured out a version of the arts program using volunteer teachers. It had run for 4 years before a foundation grant had allowed them to hire someone. She had written about that too. She had written the record of what we built in those 4 years is in the children who were in the room. They are the record. The paper version is in the folder in the file drawer, but the real record is in the people. She thought 28 people were warm on an 11-degree night because the record had always been correct, and she had not moved when someone tried to say it wasn't. She thought the record was always correct. It had been correct before Callahan came down the side door hallway. It had been correct before James arrived with his folder. It had been correct before Park read the permit. It had been correct before Thomas filmed it. It had been correct before Imani wrote it. It had been correct before the governor stood in the East Corridor and found no deficiency. The record had always said this is a legal operation. This building is permitted. These 28 people have the right to be warm. No one had changed the record. They had simply read it. Eventually. After 31 minutes. She thought Harriet said the cost is not an argument against the thing. She thought Calvin said the record is the record. She thought Reverend James said the people are the church. She thought the thing continues. She thought about Reverend James on the last day. He had handed her the key to the side office. He had said the people are the church. Everything else is architecture. She had thought at the time that he meant do not get too attached to the building. She understood now that he had meant something more specific. He had meant the building serves the people. When you protect the building, you are protecting the people's access to what the building makes possible. Protecting the permit was protecting the people. Fighting for the building was fighting for the 28 people on an 11-degree night. The architecture and the people were not in competition. The architecture was in service of the people. He had known that for 41 years. She had been learning it for 26. She thought she finally understood it completely. She turned off the desk lamp. She walked through the fellowship hall. The cots were arranged as they always were. The room was quiet. The night volunteers were at their stations. The building was warm. It was 11 degrees outside. Inside it was 68 degrees, and it smelled like apple pie and strong coffee and the particular combination of many people in a safe room. She had been in that room hundreds of times. She had never once taken it for granted. She walked to the side door. She pushed it open slightly. The cold air came in. 11 degrees. The street was quiet. She let the cold air in for 3 seconds. Then she closed the door. She looked at the permit through the glass of the frame. Permit number CU-2018-0084, valid through October of the current year. She had applied for renewal 6 weeks ago. It was already approved. She had the renewal letter in the file drawer. She had not framed it yet. She thought I should frame it. She thought tomorrow. She went home. Subscribe our channel. We find the record and we read what it says.